Good afternoon. Thank you for sticking around, and I'm happy to say that I'm not between you and drinks. There's one other speaker who's actually, you should stick around for Lindsay. I'm excited myself to hear her talk. I think it's going to be very interesting. So I'm in the Alumni Affairs office at Duke University. We are historically just undergraduate alumni, but we've really moved on to connecting and engaging all alumni of Duke. My team is responsible for the marketing and product, so we have sort of both areas. Today I'm going to talk about a very major project we've been working on for 4 years, and what's key about this is that it's been done in order to really go back to our mission of connecting and engaging. And LinkedIn, the Alumni Connect application is part of that, and we were able to accomplish that by having this larger project. I've outlined it. I want to talk about some challenges that if you're in higher ed in any kind of capacity that may be very familiar, we'll talk about some solutions and outcomes. How many people here that work for schools have been involved in a website project or a web software project? How has that been? Right? It's very hard. So what I hope is at the end of this, you'll have some sympathy for me after you hear my story. And also, I want to put the LinkedIn piece in context to that idea of a larger web project for an institution. I think there's going to be some time to have some questions afterwards, but I'll also be at the reception and be happy to talk then. So when I started 2012, this was the state of affairs. We had LinkedIn and Facebook were ascendant, right? And we all use those tools right now, but back then it was really you had to, right? Because the software at the time was pretty far behind. And so we were kind of struggling, and no offense to any vendors around that have worked for any software firms that were providing alumni software back then, but it was rough. And so then what we were providing in some ways was the digital version of this, our printed alumni directory. And that in many ways, it fulfilled the need that staff thought about and the leadership of Duke thought about. Well, we have to have a directory. But for the customer, what does this do? What does this do beyond what existing tools were there? Not a lot. And so we thought about this a lot, and we said, well, we have this problem. We're not delivering anything modern to alums. Our traction isn't very good. Our adoption is okay because alums get excited when they graduate, or students get excited when they become alums, and so they adopt, but the traction wasn't there. So we stepped back and used design thinking to pose this question: what do we imagine for the future of alumni engagement? And for those of you familiar with design thinking, it's really, instead of thinking about the problem, you think about that future state. Like where do you want to be? And we also agreed as a team to ask the question in any decision that we have to say, what is best for alumni, not what is best for Duke. And we posed it that way because, back to that traction piece, we had to get people engaged online. And it wasn't about the great sort of admin interface on the back end or sort of the outcome, right? The outcome is only going to happen if on the front end you're delivering something of value. And I'm going to, in a couple minutes, I'll talk about how this relates specifically to the LinkedIn Alumni Connect integration that we were able to do, and how we were able to use this idea. In practical terms, what we were looking at was replacing the alumni directory, as I showed, which has a profile, a whole events management piece, groups, and our website. And these are things that we needed to do. We engage over 35,000 alumni each year, and so we had to have some of this on-site, on premises, if you will. So then we went to looking at sort of 5 key principles. There was a lot of sort of requirements gathering, and again, for those of you that have gone through website redesigns or software, you may be familiar with the old concept called waterfall, which is like copious documentation. So we did that, and it was another painful process. We're now agile, fortunately, but we tried to use sort of 5 key themes to drive the conversation each time we were looking at what we're going to build. And And this was, this one in particular was, we have this great engagement, over 1,000 events a year. As I mentioned, over 30,000 alumni engaging every year with Duke around the globe. So how do we continue to support that and help, funnel that expansion? The idea as well with this is that we provide engagement that exists at the intersection. I think, before I say this, I think this has been touched on a few times earlier today, which I really liked. The engagement that a university can provide exists in some ways. It's like a Venn diagram. It's the intersection of personal, professional, and Duke, right? It can do all three of those at any time in your life and at any interest that you have. So that's a competitive advantage that I think delivers to universities a competitive brand that other brands don't have. So then the second one was really to provide new ways of engagement. So this is, as the makeup of the alumni body changes, which it does over time, as career trajectories change, all these things change. So what alumni associations and universities try to do is not only iterate through curriculum, which is really difficult, and iterate through programs, but also iterate through that post, graduation programming. Like how do we provide things of value? And so one way that's really important about what I'm talking about here is that we can only staff so many new forms of engagement, right? So a new program gets put up, suggested, and it sounds great, but it historically has meant new staffing, which universities can't add, as you all know that work at universities, you can't add staff all the time. And so how could we help volunteers drive this and provide tools that they don't currently have? And then related to that is really think about the communication channels and give some of that onus onto what was talked about earlier, the authentic voice. So the volunteer speaking to the cohort, speaking to their community. Then to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the pan-university presence, we wanted to unify the experience across Duke. And we're in this really interesting place where we're in the middle of a strategic plan. We're also at the tail end of a capital campaign. And so a lot of focus and energy has gone towards alumni engagement. And so we were able to use this project and say, not only do we want to collaborate on events in the regions with all of the schools, but let's do this new project that reaches everyone. So right now, there is only one other directory at Duke at the School of Business, and once the feature set is built out in the directory that we launched, the School of Business will close theirs, and there'll be one place for alumni to engage, one signed-in place. This, to my earlier point about sympathy, this is a lot of work, right? For those of you, I think that was touched on earlier, working within a school and trying to collaborate and bring marketing teams together in a school is hard. Bringing them, teams across the institution is even harder. Again, we had this sort of bigger mandate. We had the support, and we've had the support of the president of Duke, as well as the trustees, to basically make the case, this is going to work better for all of Duke. The size of the network indicates the network's effectiveness. Duke alums want to engage with each other irrespective of their school. The next one is really sort of on a technical sense. We knew that having talked to peers at other institutions that had done this kind of thing, that if it's only within the Alumni Association, if it's only within one small office, the fortunes change, right? You all that have worked in higher ed, you see, your office may have some funding now, and then that'll change in a year or two, depending on lots of different factors. So what we ended up doing is partnering with our central IT office and brought them in as co-sponsors. This is an IT office that had historically not had alumni as customers, right? They serve faculty, staff, and students. And they don't have to market to people, right? That cohort of faculty, staff, and students are on campus. They don't have any other choice, right? They've got to use the payroll software. They've got to use the course software. So, but in the long term, what we see is that by bringing the IT office in, what that's going to allow us to do is, as fortunes change, as staff change, or whatever changes happen in the alumni office, this is not just an alumni office thing, alumni affairs thing, it's actually all of Duke, right? So that coalition, building that coalition and providing that sort of framework was really important. And for the platform piece, we also wanted to be able to sort of hang off new software, new websites and things connected to there. And so one thing we're working on right now as an example is we've got a team working on a check-in app. And so this is for alums when they come on a campus. They often don't know, outside of major events, they don't know another alum might be there, that they went to school, they're in the same class, maybe the same dorm. They leave and they find out later. So we've got an app that we're demoing with alums right now that actually does check-in when you come onto campus. This is connected to this platform, so it's part of that. The last one is back to this value proposition, which is critical. Again, the value proposition has to exist for the alum to engage. One of the sort of drivers for this is data. In order to market well to alums, in order to build new programs, in order to connect them with the life of the institution, we have to know who they are, right? We have to line up their background at Duke with their activities now, and that's where the LinkedIn connection was key. So what we have now, and I'll show this in a minute, is a one-button click. The alum signs into their profile, they see a LinkedIn import button, they click in, and it brings the information in. To touch on that piece, the clear value proposition here, right? That's a no-brainer. The update your profile the old way is tell us what you're doing now, and they've got to type it all in. In the back of their minds, they've already done this in LinkedIn. So what we saw is we don't get a lot of jobs, right? And when we presented this idea to the stakeholders at the university, going back to like the folks that own the data, the CRM, the alumni database, they were terrified because they thought that LinkedIn was going to have access to the alumni database, right? And the alumni database is worth billions of dollars. That information in there is worth billions to Duke because that's how we fundraise, right? You connect with people by the data that you have. And so we had to think, going back to my earlier point, we had to go help them think through, this is going to work. This is going to work really well, and it's going to be a better experience for alums. And in fact, we're going to have more data. And so those conversations went back and forth, lots of disagreement there. And towards the end of it, what I did is and this is over the period of months, right, with these stakeholders. And so I put together a document. I looked up 24 alums in LinkedIn and then our back-end database, a CRM, and I put their career side by side. What they did, their professional career. And you can imagine what that looked like. For the Duke information, we had 1 or 2 jobs for people that would have a dozen jobs in their career. So I handed that to, we had a meeting, we looked at that, and there was no argument. They can't argue against that. So that, I think framing that argument in many different ways was kind of how we went about the process. So next I'm going to talk about the timeline. And you can see in here, 2 years devoted to working through these issues within the institution and trying to build the momentum for that. And that meant we had some false starts. We learned a lot during those false starts, and then we got to do some beta testing and build in 2015, and then we launched in this year in 2016 in February on the 22nd. And then what I'm going to talk about next is actually show you the site. So back to what I was saying earlier is this realignment. And so you can see on what I'm highlighting here is the realignment of the idea that we're not just for undergraduate alumni. So going from a Duke Alumni Association, which was thought of as sort of Trinity, which is our undergraduate school, to Duke Alumni. So this is a big branding change in many ways, but what it meant is that it's a home for the school of business, law, name it, all the alums. The other thing to point out here is that we've got the sign-in CTA, and so that was something we put throughout the site is really, really important. Whoops. So next slide, it shows the search. And so this is our directory. And I think this screenshot, I realize the screenshot is outdated because we update this every couple weeks. You can see we follow the sort of the LinkedIn model for filters, but we also have, again, back to the idea of living at the intersection of personal, professional, and Duke. We have a lot of Duke data that we're going to put in filters there. And so student activities, so people that were on the student newspaper and in my class year and in a certain profession, we can provide that. In early October, we're going to open this up to students. So right now, 163,000 alumni have access to this. In October, we open up to the 10,000 students at Duke, and they will have the same experience of searching through the directory with the difference of the way that they contact alums. So they'll see the full profile, which I'll show you in a second. They won't see phone or email address. And this was, again, a big process to work through lots of offices, career center, schools, and to figure out what's going to work for everyone and be sort of the baseline and preserve the privacy and the sense of among alumni that we're looking after their best interests. So on the profile, you can see the LinkedIn import buttons. And so what we did is when we launched, we had the LinkedIn import button on the professional tab, which you see here. Under the About tab, we have Duke information and family information. Under My Duke, it's kind of the connective, the alumni activities. So my section of professional here is representative of what we would see with an alum. We don't have a summary. We maybe have an industry. And then this is the kind of information we had about jobs. I don't know, for those of you that are familiar with your CRMs at your institutions, you may be familiar with what fields are in there. Ours really had very little. And so we would have title, employer, start date, end date. And that's it. And so if you were an attorney for a firm, no one at Duke knew your practice area, right? You'd have to go to LinkedIn to look at that. And so Duke didn't really have that information in any scale. And I'll show the walkthrough in a second. One thing I want to mention with this is when we launched, again, we had the button under the professional tab. And as we watched usage, we weren't excited about it was somewhat modest, and so we wanted to increase usage. So we duplicated the button underneath the green button up top, one that says View Public Profile. Once we did that, we doubled traffic and doubled adoption of this. So that was a good change. That's the kind of thing that we've been looking at in our site, is like, how can we tweak the visual experience, the customer experience to drive greater adoption. So walking through, so if I click the button, what happens is I come to this authorization page. You have probably seen this with lots of different websites, if not for LinkedIn, when they have Facebook sign in or Twitter sign in, it's similar. What happens here, once you authorize this is a stored authorization. So once an alum does this, it's stored. Duke has that. And the thing we're not doing right now that is in our roadmap is that we can go back at any point in time and ping that person's profile on LinkedIn and pull their updates down. We haven't built that out just yet, but that's kind of the goal, and I think that's going to be really powerful. Right now, it's a one-time import. So after I've clicked the Allow Access button, it gets me into this Verify Import. This took a lot of time. I can't tell you, this looks very simple, but it was really interesting because if you think about, if you're going to build a company and you need new users, you've got a brand new profile, right? You just bring them in, they fill out information, they're good. For institutions, we already have data. And even though I said, the data's not good, it's important that we keep it because in some cases, these include matching gift companies. So even though we don't know a lot about your job at IBM, IBM's doing matching gifts, and we don't want to, dismantle that. We can't let that break apart. So what we did with here is we also thought about how do we let the alum import everything and update their information. So we talked about a couple times thinking about doing a reconciliation or a matching. So the idea that you've got information on the Duke side, and then you've got information coming from LinkedIn. Do we let people match and overwrite? And once we started going down that path and looking at the designs, we realized that it wasn't going to work very well. There's going to be a lot of friction in the process, and we might get some abandonment, right? So we went ahead and said, and I don't know if you can see the default setting, but it's basically like that's Duke information below, and it says remove. And so it basically lets the LinkedIn career information overwrite the Duke career information. And they tell me that in the backend CRM, nothing's ever deleted. It's always there. But to the alum, it's gone. And so we did have, and I think Harvard Business School has to do the same kind of thing. We do have some back office processes where they will look at current job that comes in when this happens to make sure that that current job is still linked to a employer that we have in the system. There's a lot of logic there that I think can be optimized and improved, but that's the way we have it right now. We're using staff for that. No one, to date, no one has complained about this feature being, the remove part. They're all pretty happy with it. Then we can import the photo. Another key aspect. There's other things we're not importing right now. Publications, patents, and a couple of other things. And that challenge too is for those of you that have talked to your folks at your schools about this. Again, it's got to match up to something in the institutional database, the CRM. And if it can't, then you have to have a bunch of meetings to figure out how to do that mapping. And we recognize that the real value was in the job information. We want to do that first. Later on, we may add in some of this other. So then after the import's done, you can see, if you can recall what my profile looked like before, it was pretty lean, right? And so this is the new profile. And we were talking, I think someone was talking earlier about outcomes, and I know I've talked to some colleagues, some LinkedIn folks about outcomes. So the idea that we could at some point take this data and look at outcomes. So the neuroscience major at Duke University is only 4 years old, and they would love to know if what they're teaching in their curriculum is leading to successful careers for their students, right? How do they know that, right? They've got to send out surveys. They ask a bunch of questions. Survey response, for those of you that have run surveys, it's often single-digit returns. What this lets us do is they didn't come in here to tell us how they did in their career, right? But they are in some ways because they're sharing this, and so this will be some interesting information that we can at some point delve into with our colleagues in the departments around Duke. Now I'm going to talk about some outcomes that we've seen, and I'm using the model promoted by Avnish Kaushik, who's the chief marketing evangelist for Google, writes the great blog Occam's Razor, if you haven't read that before. And he talks about a sort of 3-step model of user acquisition, behaviors in the application or the website, and outcomes. And so for our first step, which is the acquisition piece, we've looked at, since February 22nd when we launched, we've had around 8% of our target alumni base register in the site. We've had some great repeat sign-ins. I think we're around 25% for weekly repeat sign-in. We've done a little bit of marketing, and not a ton. We did a marketing push in June and July for May grads, and that had around a 25% return rate, which was outstanding. That's a great cohort, though. Like the recent grads, they're all about it, right? They're excellent. We did another push last week that was more of an informative push, and then we're looking at sort of how do we tweak this, especially on the site. We haven't turned this up, but once we do some changes on the site, we're going to look to try to improve conversions on site, right? So we can, because for any of you, your site visitation is probably giant, right? You're going to get more of your customers coming to your website just to look for information than most channels you have, right? And so that's why we're looking at ramping this up. The second step is behaviors in the site, and so we have around a third of all sign-in people every week are editing some piece of information in the site. So they're really engaging, right? Which is excellent. So they're sharing information. Again, they're coming to our site not to do this activity. They're coming to the site because they're interested in events in their region. They want to volunteer. They have a child who's interested in applying at Duke. Got a lot of that. We're looking at directory searches, class notes, which is anachronistic for many of us, right? Comes from the magazine, right? The magazine, the original, Facebook in some ways comes out of class notes in the back of a magazine. The idea of this update, there's still some value in that, and I think it's a really interesting piece because it's the seminal update of your life, right? And typically what we see that when that's shared, it's before reunions. You want to let people know what you've been up to. It's very different than a Facebook update that is really ephemeral. And then we're looking at a lot of behaviors and profile information. So then the outcomes, this number is looking, so we've more than doubled the number of new jobs that we gain each week on average from the last system that we had, which was Harris Connect, which is now iModules. Very different interface, very different sort of drivers there, but this has been fantastic. So we're really learning a lot more about our alums every single week. The average number of jobs imported per alum is around 4.5, I think. So I've talked a lot about this data collection piece. What this really is about, though, is not just the data collection, but the data is a means to drive what we track our 3 primary modes of engagement. One is events. We want to get people to events. I mentioned the numbers around that. We want to get volunteers. We want to keep volunteers. And then donations. Showing the outcome of donations is really difficult, right? You can't, we can show the click-through rate from our site to the giving page. We track all that. It's not huge numbers. What we talk about, and when we sort of showed this model and this idea, is we would talk about the analogy of a donor. We've got a donor right now who's crested the $100 million mark in cumulative donations. When he graduated in 1971, he had college debt, and over the years, he's very successful. He gives to the Washington Monument. He supported that, the National Zoo. He's head of the Harvard Capital Campaign. He's been in charge of our capital campaign. And so what Duke was able to do with him was not only keep his affinity strong with the institution, but really grow it over time because he has lots of options. And so when we would make the argument of the outcome here, we would say the next billionaire just graduated from Duke. She has lots of debt. And so she's not a prospect. She doesn't have a rating, right? Parents don't have any money. But in 20 years, what will Duke have done to not only, again, keep her affinity strong, but grow it over time and make her feel really connected to the institution? This piece here, again, is important to share with colleagues. So we do a lot of sharing of these numbers with colleagues across the institution, not just in our office, so that they're aware that we are sort of supporting the bigger picture of Duke. So I'm at the end. I want to conclude with the sort of idea that building out the LinkedIn Alumni Connect, which I showed you here, was a fantastic piece of a larger project. And then I think really getting the coalition together across Duke to really support this idea of a new form, new ways of alumni engagement made it possible to overcome the hurdles of the recalcitrant ideas around social media, which people have couched that in. So I'm going to be at the reception and would be happy to talk to folks, but I believe that I have a few minutes to take some questions, if there's any questions. Yes.
In terms of your registration, this is more of a technical question, but just in terms of registration, because I always find that having people sign up for one more thing is a challenge. How are you guys addressing that, and are you doing single sign-on with LinkedIn or another way?
Good question. So the question was around how do you sort of remove friction in the process of getting people from not having an account to having an account? And that's been a key challenge. So one of the things that we, again, back to sort of the pan-university piece, is we ended up collaborating with the central IT office to do a single sign-on. And unfortunately, that was a rough process. We initially signed on with Gigya, which is a identity provider, but didn't build up with all of their tools. And so we've had to sort of work through internally how to onboard people. The good thing is once we get critical mass with all of our alums, and they all have this single sign-on, at that point, all we have to do is convert new grads. And that's been a really easy process. It's just getting all of the alums to register this thing first. The other thing that we've done with that is, and this is a little bit harder sell because it drives less to an emotional response, and it's more of a logical thing, but this single sign-on is for all of Duke. And so we're also at the same time trying to get offices that have, different websites or web apps that cater to alums to adopt this thing. The next one that we're going after is athletics, because they've got sort of sign in place. But that's been a part of the building process as well. Other questions? Okay. Thank you so much.